Crime and Punishment by Fyodor Dostoevsky is one of the most compelling novels of crime, redemption, and mental illness ever to hit the literary scene. Today in this video, we're going to be discussing the legacy and intricacies and complexities of Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment. So we will start with some general overview type critiques, and then we will kind of move into the meat and potatoes of the actual novel. Let me know in the comments below if you've read Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment. Please follow me on Instagram at Andrew Marlowe Artist Official. Send me an email at andrewmarlowe22@gmail.com if you have any questions about the channel or you would like to talk about books. Let me know what your favorite author is. Let me know what your favorite Dostoevsky is. And we are going to be continuing the Dostoevsky project. Now, first and foremost, when you're coming to Crime and Punishment, I will say that the most challenging aspect of it for me is not because it's Russian literature or the culture of Russia. It was hard to understand back then. For me, what's complicated about Fyodor Dostoevsky, the dog is barking again. What makes Crime and Punishment and Dostoevsky in general a bit of a challenge is the sheer number of characters that actually exist. And for the record, it is storming outside, so you might hear some wind and some rain. Hopefully it'll add a little bit of an ASMR touch to this content. So there, not only are there a large cast of characters, but there's so much going on between said characters that make the narrative of Dostoevsky often a little bit challenging, a little bit complex. Now, I will say that that is what also makes Dostoevsky interesting and fascinating, because every single character influences or impacts or has some type of emotional relation or familial relation or karmic relation, so to speak, to the other characters. But I will say that sometimes Dostoevsky loses the plot with all of the other complexities of the other non-protagonists. But there are every single character that comes up in Crime and Punishment, for example. By the way, we read the Constance Garnett translation. And like I've said in some of the recent uploads, this is definitely not my favorite cover. But as far as the translation, I don't have a whole lot of critiques of it, other than some of it is a little bit antiquated, painfully Victorian, as David Foster Wallace suggested. But overall, Constance Garnett gets right to the point. Some of her particular words, phrases, aka sentences, don't necessarily translate, I don't think, in the best way. They come across as a little bit just cringy maybe, but overall the substance, the overall integrity of Dostoevsky's vision, his words and his rhetoric remains very well intact with Constance Garnett. And I don't say that it's bad to have a lot of characters, right? But I will say that I think he gets a little distracted with some of the character arcs of all these different characters. But having said that, we learn about Raskolnikov, and Raskolnikov sort of embarks on his own character arc through these other characters, you see. So these other characters, it's not that they're not necessary, it's just that it takes a long time to sort of peel back the layers and how it all kind of comes back to Raskolnikov, if you will, to sort of see why he's spending so much time on these other characters. So hopefully that makes sense. And I will say that Dostoevsky is very, very dense. He's very philosophical. He tends to be kind of rambly at times, but that's kind of what makes Dostoevsky, and that's kind of what sort of that Russian aesthetic is. Other Russian authors such as Nabokov, which sort of take a different approach, a much more sort of maybe Hemingway-esque approach to their writing, more condensed versus dense. Dostoevsky is very dense. He has really, really long paragraphs. So that can also be kind of a challenge. Sometimes you're wondering, when is Dostoevsky going to get to the point? But overall, Crime and Punishment is a tour de force of mental illness, of spiritual salvation, redemption, sin, lust. I mean, anything under the sun, religion, philosophy, it's all harrowingly depicted in the pages of Fyodor Dostoevsky. Now, Dostoevsky versus Tolstoy, I would say Dostoevsky is much more of a sort of a psychologically concerned writer Not that Tolstoy is not. Tolstoy is more about sort of this collective sociology, if you will, right? Sort of like Jordan Peterson talked about. But Dostoevsky is more like the nitty gritty mental illness. And not that Tolstoy didn't deal with those things or didn't express those things in his characters, because obviously he did. But I think Tolstoy had more of sort of a hopeful, and not that Dostoevsky is not hopeful, but Tolstoy was more of this, wanted to bring humanity into this sort of philosophically upright heaven, I guess you could say, sort of this morally upright, non-self-serving sort of utopia, whereas Dostoevsky sort of sat in the negativity, the sadness, the depression, the mental illness, the crimes, the criminals, the drugs, the alcoholics, and kind of sat there, stewed in it, philosophized on it, and didn't necessarily wish to take humanity to this sort of preconceived utopia of social morality in the same manner that Tolstoy would have, rather. So just a little bit interesting way to compare the two authors. I think that's important too. Russian literature in general tends to deal with not only sort of the oppression, I guess you could say, of the Tsarist 1800s, 1700s Tsarist Russia, the peasants versus the rich bourgeoisie, but it also is not afraid to delve into sort of the more privileged characters, if you will, that are still very much unhappy, whether or not they're poor, rich, man, woman, what have you. Pretty much every character on every single social stratus or social level has some level of struggles, and that's what makes Dostoevsky such a wonderful author. So let's get into Crime and Punishment. Obviously, I don't want to give away too much, but obviously it involves a main protagonist by the name of Raskolnikov. All these Russians got super long names, so I'm probably going to be abbreviating and just sticking with the regular names. Raskolnikov, obviously, he is this student. He lives in St. Petersburg, in the universe of St. Petersburg, Russia, during this time, and just in general is a whole wealth, a gold mine of, religious, political, and sort of socio-political historical tensions, but also art and music and literature and culture. So really interesting place. Unfortunately, a lot of people don't visit Russia nowadays, which is unfortunate, because I would like to see some of the places that Dostoevsky was influenced by, go to some of the museums and see some of these locations firsthand. But anyway, Raskolnikov is a little bit disillusioned. He starts philosophizing on morality and religion and his education. And he's a little bit disillusioned, and he goes to this pawnbroker, this old lady. This lady is pretty stingy, and this lady, although she's vulnerable and old and helpless and weak and feeble, she is at the same time taking advantage of very, very poor people that come to trade the last of their belongings. And this lady kind of rips all these poor people off, and the lady smells, and she's got matted hair. And you can sort of get the idea of this repulsion that Raskolnikov feels towards this not only feeble and sort of decrepit old lady, but the greed that this lady sort of exudes. So he sort of comes up with this whole philosophical plot in his mind to unlive this old lady. She goes by the name of Alyana. She's got a long name too. We'll just stick with Alyana. And he unlives this lady, and that's where sort of the whole narrative sort of explodes in the universe of Crime and Punishment. The floodgates open with that initial crime that takes place. Now, the title of the book, Crime and Punishment, yes, Raskolnikov does eventually suffer the consequences of his crimes, but that's not really Dostoevsky's main concern in terms of, going to Siberia or going to the prison camp or being arrested. The real punishment that takes place in the universe and the mindset of Raskolnikov is the mental punishment, the emotional, socio sort of political punishment, the shame, the humiliation, the paranoia that takes place in the world of Raskolnikov, the mind of Raskolnikov, the heart, soul, and body of Raskolnikov, but also all the other characters that this protagonist, that being Raskolnikov, cares deeply about. All of these other characters are having to be lied to. Raskolnikov is having to deceive them. He's having to walk around with averting his eyes because he's so ashamed of what he's done. But on the one hand, he's ashamed of it. He's feeling bad about it, but he also feels he had this moral obligation that justified the unliving of Alyona. So it's a little bit borderline sociopathic the way that Raskolnikov sort of wrestles with the concept of good versus evil, but what makes it tolerable, if you will, I mean, obviously Raskolnikov is a criminal. He's a little bit of a sociopath. But in the grand scheme of things, he's also kind of not, because he's technically doing this crime for a good cause, if that's a thing. And that happens all the time, I think, whether it's stealing candy or, punishing, getting revenge on a bad person, or getting to something before another worse off person or an even more evil person gets to it before you do, that sort of thing. And everybody wrestles with that. And that's kind of what makes Crime and Punishment so wonderfully compelling, is that we all sort of struggle with this idea of good and evil, and taking the law into our own hands, or taking morality into our own hands, taking right and wrong into our own sort of vision of what we think is going right or wrong in the lives of the people around us. Moving a little bit away from Raskolnikov, obviously we have his sort of love interest, his confidant, which is Sonia. We also have an even worse individual named Svadrigailov that comes up, and we'll talk a little bit more about him. Obviously we have Pulcheria is Raskolnikov's mother. We have Raskolnikov's sisters, and we have Razumuhin. We have an entire cast of characters, and obviously we won't be able to cover every single one or how they exactly relate to Raskolnikov, but pretty much the main characters you need to remember are Raskolnikov, Sonia, Raskolnikov's mother, Pulcheria, obviously Svadrigailov, and also there's a lot of important characters, and I really am hesitant to rank them on their importance level because they all influence Raskolnikov's worldview and vice versa. But we also have a lot of deceptive characters, aka Svadrigailov, who is obviously, not even arguably, he's definitely a much worse individual than Raskolnikov. And the whole philosophy of Crime and Punishment, I think, really lies in not only Raskolnikov and his crimes, his mistakes, his desires, his worldview, but also the way that it sort of clashes with Svadrigailov's, and obviously the old lady too, that becomes a victim of Raskolnikov's sort of world vision for morality and revenge and taking back the power of the less fortunate into his own hands. But Svadrigailov in particular not only mirrors the evil aspects, both mentally, emotionally, spiritually, religiously, of Raskolnikov, right? But he's sort of mirroring this sort of whole other idea of morality that Dostoevsky is wrestling with these characters. And sort of redemption or crime or good and evil are sort of put into the same, sort of wrestling match together. And what level of evil is the worst? What level of revenge is the worst? What motivation to commit evil acts or crimes or sort of hostilities towards mankind? When do those become justified? When do the ends sort of justify the means? Pretty much is what I'm saying. And you'll start to really question that in your own mind, and you'll sort of leave. At the end of Crime and Punishment, you'll leave that universe questioning good and evil on a level that I don't think you'll ever have before. Obviously, there's other great writers. There's other sort of philosophical, religious writers. But in particular, and also mentioning Dostoevsky, what occurs in many of Dostoevsky's characters is this fascination that Dostoevsky has on this sort of feverish delirium, mental illness that takes place. And you can see maybe where Thomas Wolfe sort of got the idiosyncrasies of how to describe an uncomfortable mental, emotional situation, because these characters sweat, they toss and turn at night. And it reminded me a lot of the Eugene Gant character when he was teaching at the university, and when he was having to deal with the pressure from his peers and his students. I got like a frog in my throat or something. So Dostoevsky is not only fascinated with mental illness, mental delirium, but he presents it as this feverish, almost sort of insatiable itch this terrible hunger to get to the other side, to get some relief from this fever. And it's a literal fever. I mean, these characters are sort of in and out of sleep. They're collapsing. And it's very similar to Notes from the Underground, where that main protagonist has this dual personality where he sort of slips in between mental illness, or even like The Double, for example, that we've covered. Make sure you guys check out all the previous playlists for all these old content that we've covered. But we do plan to do much more Dostoevsky in the future. But I will say that obviously Crime and Punishment has a huge reputation, and a lot of people come to Crime and Punishment based on its reputation alone. And I think we come into Crime and Punishment knowing sort of what we're getting ourselves into. We're going to be talking about crazy characters, criminal characters, good versus evil. But Dostoevsky doesn't just lead you to the water and then walk off. He sort of leads you slowly to the water, and he actually does kind of walk off. He sort of leads you to the water, but he lets you do that. Dostoevsky forces you not only to face the complexities of so many of this wonderful cast of characters that take place, but he's also forcing you to wrestle with your own self. What would you do in these characters' shoes? What would you do in these people's situations? But also, not only going a little bit further past the elements of good and evil and all that, we have these, we talked about how Dostoevsky presents, character A as bad, character B as even worse, and character C or whatever as the most horrible person that we can imagine, aka Svidrigailov. He's probably the worst character, and in comparison to Raskolnikov, we are much more invested in Raskolnikov's story and his vision and his hopes and dreams and depressions, and we're almost kind of rooting for Raskolnikov by a little over the halfway point, perhaps going towards the end, because of the way that he cares for these other cast of characters, but also the lengths that Raskolnikov is willing to go to undermine the evil intentions of all the other characters. You see, so although Raskolnikov is a little bit questionable, he's not honest, he's a criminal, he's sort of like that good criminal that we all love to love, right? Obviously, literature has a whole history of bad characters, but Svidrigailov probably ranks as one of the worst. Interestingly enough, he not only is he a bad person and he has done terrible things to Raskolnikov's sister, he also sort of uses the guilt and sort of the feverish delirium and the unsolicited confessions of Raskolnikov, and he sort of sneaks around and eavesdrops and on all these other characters, and he doesn't sort of do what you would expect. I don't want to give too much away. He doesn't do what the normal person would do if they overheard somebody confessing about a crime. He uses this information in the most torturously devious manner to sort of slowly make these other characters extremely uncomfortable and just to kind of mentally torture them. And by the end of it, Svidrigailov meets his own demise. So as you're reading the pages of Crime and Punishment, you are sort of on the edge of your seat because you want to know, is Raskolnikov going to confess, right? What's going to happen to him? Are they going to discover him? Is he going to turn himself in? And all of those questions slowly become answered, but there's this whole other sort of slow burn of how Raskolnikov reaches those decisions, right? How he comes to terms with his own guilt, how he decides to confess, how he decides to turn himself in, but also the way that all this other tremendous cast of characters influences him to do that. So Raskolnikov is not just saying, okay, I did a bad thing, I'm turning myself in. He's leveraging and questioning and sort of pushing and pulling between how his actions and the misfortunes of all the other characters around him, how does that make him make the decisions that he needs to make to either confess or come to terms with his crime. And he lollygags a lot. He avoids punishment. He lies to his family members. And that's what's so fascinating also about the world of Crime and Punishment, is that it's this horrible situation that's going on, right? These destitute, depressed, mentally ill, evil characters. But we have some wonderful, heartwarming scenes and sort of wonderful, hopeful, loving characters that we want to help, like Raskolnikov's family, for example, like Sonia. Sort of familial and sort of community espionage that sort of takes place, and some of these characters are working against other characters. They're trying to sabotage each other, they're lying to each other, they're cheating each other, and that it's almost like this giant Russian soap opera, if you will. And and I think, like we said in the beginning, in the introduction of this video, occasionally Dostoevsky does, I dare say, I think he loses the plot a little bit, and sometimes you're wondering, why is he writing about these other characters when we really just want to know about Raskolnikov? And I think Crime and Punishment, to understand his worldview, Dostoevsky's worldview and his vision, and sort of the aesthetic technique that he was using for Crime and Punishment, is, could take years to really study and really experience. But there are parts of it where you're kind of wishing it would get to the next chapter, and you're wishing it would, the situations, the characters would resolve themselves, and you're kind of scratching your head, why is he spending so much time rambling about all these other sort of smaller characters? But you have to remember, like I said, all these other characters, in one way or another, lead Raskolnikov to that water of redemption, of confession, of facing his crimes, of facing the concept of good and evil. But we also sort of have this in the dialogue of, obviously Raskolnikov is a student, and he sort of is wrestling with not only good and evil, right, on sort of a societal level, but he's sort of questioning his role as a student. Does he really want to be a student? Is he sort of just pursuing this collegiate educational enterprise? Is he pursuing that for the right reasons or the wrong reasons? And he has sort of these philosophical debates with his friend. His name is escaping me at the moment. But he has a lot of wonderful relationships, that being Raskolnikov, despite the fact that he is lying about who he is throughout the majority of the novel. But he actually uses his crimes to enrich and sort of help the other people around him. I don't want to give every single thing away that he does, but you can see that Raskolnikov is tortured by the evils that exist in his world, in the St. Petersburg, Russia at this time, and he's sort of starting at the lowest level possible, and thinking that if I get rid of this one little ounce of evil and deceit, that being the old lady that's taking advantage of people, it will somehow have this, sort of have this cascading, what do they call it? Like a ripple effect, and everything else will improve if we start at the bottom of injustice, perhaps. I think that's kind of where I'm taking it. Like, he's not going out and attacking the bourgeoisie, right? He's not going out and trying to overthrow the czar, or corrupt the, overtake the corrupt police department, or embezzle money from the rich banks into the, he's basically starting from this mangy, greedy, ugly old lady that's taking advantage of people, and he's saying, yes, that is where we have to start if we want to see societal change. I think also that's what's so fascinating about that, is that it's not so much this sort of war and peace, philosophical good and evil on a large social level. It's more of like, on an individual level, I'm going to make the decisions about morality. I'm going to make the decisions about which characters are good. I'm going to get rid of this old lady that's taking advantage of people to help my family, to help my immediate surroundings. And Raskolnikov, you sort of sneaks around and he lies to the people that he loves. But meanwhile, they know something is a little cuckoo with him, right? So he's not deceiving them 100%. I mean, he's not getting away with, he sneaks back into his flat and he collapses into these feverish deliriums. And that's I think what I liked the most about Dostoevsky was the early part where Raskolnikov was sort of dealing with these sort of fits of mental illness. And maybe that is akin to Dostoevsky's own, not only his own twisted mind, but it was also maybe a reference to his epilepsy, perhaps. Dostoevsky did suffer from epilepsy, and he wrote Crime and Punishment shortly after he returned from his, 9 or 10 year exile in Siberia, where he was in the prison camps. He was a big gambler. He lost money, just couldn't pay his debts. They put him in the Siberian prison camp. And that, if it wasn't for these horrible things that happened to Dostoevsky, we wouldn't have the wonderful oeuvre of the wonderful output of Dostoevsky. And we do have a whole stack of Dostoevsky here. We'll actually go grab them right now, ranging all the way from Notes from the Underground to Crime and Punishment, to Humiliated and Insulted, to The House of the Dead. This is basically documents his experience in the Siberian prison camp. Going back to The Idiot, about a sort of a morally upright character that sort of wrestles with a corrupt society. Now, obviously, we have Devils, but you can see what Dostoevsky is doing. He's exploring the uncomfortable, whether that's religiously speaking, like he does with with Brothers Karamazov back there, which we haven't read yet. That's why you should keep all your authors together, because sometimes you have a couple other books by an author that you forget about if they're in a different category or whatever. So he's wrestling with all things uncomfortable, mentally, spiritual, religiously, social, politically, financially. But he's not some people critiqued my Notes from the Underground, the double analysis, because I sort of said that Dostoevsky had sort of a nihilistic worldview. But what I meant by that was some of his characters have a nihilistic worldview. That doesn't mean that Dostoevsky himself is promoting nihilism, right? Like other authors perhaps might, but a lot of his characters are pretty nihilistic. They resent people, they resent authority, they resent life, they resent pretty much anything you can think of. But going slowly back to Crime and Punishment, I think it would definitely take a rereading. I always suggest rereading, maybe 6 months apart, maybe a year apart. Go back and reread some of those, your most beloved books of literature, and that way you can sort of get any of the missing pieces that you might have missed. But in general, Crime and Punishment is rather easy to read. I'm not going to say it's easy to read. It takes work. It takes concentration. You have to be present. You have to keep the characters separate and keep everybody organized in your mind. But in general, it's not this super intimidating, untouchable, so philosophically complex novel that you shouldn't read it. I definitely think you should read it. And you can see the influence of obviously of Crime and Punishment, Dostoevsky, on so many of the other authors that we've covered, all the way from William Faulkner to David Foster Wallace, perhaps, and even John Steinbeck and Thomas Wolfe and Nabokov. I mean, Dostoevsky is a household name for a reason. Is he overrated, perhaps? I don't think it's fair for me to make that call yet. I haven't read enough of his material. But I would have liked to see Dostoevsky ramble a little bit less. I would have liked to see him not distract us so much from Raskolnikov and his worldview. Maybe I would have loved to see him cut out maybe at least 2 or 3 characters so that we weren't being introduced to a new character every other chapter. So those are basically my critiques of it, and those are pretty fair critiques. I'm not saying that the character arcs were not good or the plot wasn't good. It is engaging, but occasionally it hits these little peaks and valleys, as one of my friends used to say about something. But you could apply that term to reading Dostoevsky. He has these little peaks where things get real exciting and it sort of reaches climax, and then they kind of get a little bit slow, a little bit boring, perhaps, dare I say, and you just are wishing to get to the next part of the exciting part about what's going to happen to Raskolnikov. There is a lot of dialogue that's a little hard to follow, I would say. Dialogue in general, I've always wrestled with in novels because it can be hard to follow, and it becomes tedious, especially if the author doesn't leave a lot of good tags, either before or after, letting you know who's talking, who's philosophizing. But in general, Crime and Punishment is a strong Russian novel, a complex Russian novel with many complexities that we probably missed. Maybe half of them went over my head. Maybe there's some kind of biblical, philosophical, social critique. You could go down that rabbit hole. Obviously we keep saying good and evil, but there's obviously a lot more to it. But basically it's a very, very conflicted character that takes the law, takes sort of good and evil and morality into his own hands and does a good deed but suffers for it, not only by going to Siberia, being punished by the law, but this burden, this horrible, stressful burden that he has to go around and lie about and suffer from. And that pretty much is my version of Crime and Punishment in a nutshell. Please let me know your thoughts and comments in the comment section below on anything I might have missed about Crime and Punishment, and what's your favorite translation of Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment. We will talk to you all in the next one.